Welcome back to U.S. History. Today, we're going to finish Chapter 4. Let's get into it. All right, welcome back. So this is Chapter 4. It's called Life in the Colonies, and we're going to talk about three major things. The first is the growth of slavery in the New World. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about the Great Awakening. Okay, there's the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. This is the First Great Awakening. So it just kind of gives you an idea of the mindset of the colonists, what's happening. Some things might not be going the way they wanted. We'll talk about it. It'll make sense in a minute. And then we're going to visit the Enlightenment. I have a bunch of Enlightenment thinkers down here. Locke and Montesquieu are the only two you need to know. And if you want to be cool and know about Voltaire and Pufendorf, then you can. All right, so let's get going. Your goals for today: understand the scope of slavery, its origins, its growth, its breadth, its infesting a whole region. Let's talk about it. What is triangle trade? It's between the colonies, England, and Africa. And the most important part for you to remember is something called the Middle Passage. That is the part of the triangle with people on it. People are going to be brought from Africa and traded as slaves. So that's called the Middle Passage. Why is education important in the colonies? For religious purposes, so you can read the Bible. And what is the Great Awakening? It is a revival. All right, so let's take a look at the data here. The Atlantic slave trade. Okay, so most of the slaves are going to be brought to the Bahamas, and they're going to be used to grow sugarcane. And if you're not going to be brought to the Bahamas, statistically, you're going to go to Brazil. Okay, so that's the destination where most people are headed. And then you can see on there, going to America is about British America, that's 4.5%. Spanish America, that's 15%. Basically, you want to, if you're around the equator, the closer you are to the equator, where you can grow sugar, that's determining your destination, if that makes sense. Okay, they don't have quite the cash crops they do as you move up north. That will change later with cotton and whatnot. But for right now, that's the breakdown. What crops are labor intensive? We talked about it: sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton coming up soon. So here's a map that shows triangle trade, and you can see items are going from North America to Europe, from Europe to Africa, and then right there you see the Middle Passage. That's where the slaves going from Africa to the Caribbean or wherever their destination is. That's the Middle Passage. That's today's primary source. So make sure you read that. If you're online at home, it'll be attached to this video. If you're in here in class, we'll read that in a minute. Here we're talking about items going from New England to Africa, etc. That's triangle trade. Okay. I look at this slide and I go, hey, 500,000 to British America. That's a lot of people. And then if you go back to that pie chart, that just gives you it exposes the depth of the problem, the breadth of the problem. If that 500,000 people is 4.5%, then how many people are going to Brazil? How many people are going to the Bahamas? A lot. Okay, so here's the primary source about Equiano. Let's read this. Okay, here's a small video about Equiano.
The enslavement of the African peoples, the transatlantic slave trade, and the plantation system that followed initiated the largest sustained commercial trading of human beings in history. Some scholars estimate that more than 20 million Africans were transported to the New World. The few slave narratives that are presented in this exhibit reflect only a fraction of the millions upon millions of stories that could have been told by people who had the misfortune to toil under the yoke of slavery. Although each of their stories is as unique and individual as a fingerprint, describing as they do a different heartbreak, and a different survival strategy. The brief glimpse provided in this exhibit will give you an introduction to the ways in which lives were affected by slavery. Olaudah Equiano was born in 1745 in what is today Nigeria. As a young boy, he and his sister were kidnapped, gagged, tied, and taken from their home. During his life as a slave, Equiano was sold 10 times and underwent 3 name changes. The following passage was taken from his autobiography.
The first objects which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast were the sea and the slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and awaiting its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I was sound by some of the crew. And I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions differed so much from ours, their long hair and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief, as well as the multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow. No, I no longer doubted my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. When I recovered a little, I found some black people about me, who I believe were some of those who brought me on board. They were receiving their pay. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining its shore.
Okay, so in 1652, you've got laws that are banning slavery. This is before the United States, over 100 years before there is a United States. And there's already places that have slavery and places that want to ban it, all right? In Georgia, it was a debtor's colony, so there's no slavery allowed in its since its origin, and that'll maintain itself up until about 1750. So, but then there's also laws that are trying to institutionalize and solidify slavery. So here, Maryland in 1639 has its first law that you're a slave for life. No more. Remember, I've talked about how slave and indentured servant, although they're different, even being a slave, good chance you could get out of it. That's until these type of laws where now you're a slave for life. And then look at this, in 1663, Virginia, a child born of a slave is a slave. So now the slavery is getting passed down. So in certain places, they're trying to ban it. In other places, it's getting worse. Spoiler alert, that's going to come to a head during the Civil War. Okay? Of course there's going to be resistance. The slaves outnumber the master, and so they're going to have a variety of slave uprisings, which will lead to these slave codes. And this I want you to write down. What are the slave codes? What are examples of the slave codes? You cannot meet in large numbers. Slaves cannot own weapons. They can't leave the plantation without permission, and you can't teach a slave to read and write. Why? Why can't a slave learn to read and write? Think about that for a minute. Okay, the easy hanging fruit, the low hanging fruit is because if you can read or write, then you can organize better and you can have uprisings easier. That's true. But there's something else. When you free your mind, once your mind is free, once you become educated, it's much harder to keep that person a slave. Like once you've just tasted the freedom, even in your mind, of reading and writing and becoming educated, you're not going to want to stay a slave. And so these all become slave codes. Your book is talking about African slaves keeping their culture, especially the culture of West Africa, alive. It talks about using drums and banjo. It also mentions in there certain decor, wearing grass skirts, or creating, the clothing, traditional clothing. I want to put in teacher's note. When it comes to cultures, I always relate or like or enjoy or embrace the food. Have you ever had African cuisine? They make some awesome pumpkin curries. At least that's what I've had. I just want to recommend that you try some food if you've never had that. If that's your thing. I like the different foods. Different cultures, different food. Never met food I didn't like. That's just me. Okay, so let's talk about education. You need to read because you need to read the Bible. Okay, so religion, it has, you had the Pilgrims, you had the Puritans. You've got these religious seeds planted in North America, and then out of that you get a variety of outcomes. One of them is going to be an emphasis on reading and writing and education so that you can read the Bible, okay? We're going to talk about Ben Franklin. He's coming on the scene pretty young in this picture. He's an author, a scientist, he's an inventor, he's a diplomat. He's going to be important in getting France to come over and help us win the revolution. So we know Benjamin Franklin, he writes this thing called Poor Richard's Almanac. You get 2 for 1 today. That's your second primary source of the day. That'll also be attached to the video, and we'll be reading that in just a second. Here's a short video about Benjamin Franklin.
Most Americans are familiar with the story of Benjamin Franklin and his kite. How on one June day in 1752, he flew that kite during a thunderstorm and ended up discovering electricity. But did it really happen? As it turns out, most historians believe there is some truth to the story, but it's a little more complicated than popular legend makes it out to be. For one thing, Franklin didn't discover electricity. People already knew about it at the time of his experiments. Franklin wasn't even the first to propose that a lightning bolt was a form of electricity. Other scientists already suspected that. But after explaining the similarities he saw between electricity and lightning, including the color, crooked formation, and crackling sound, he was the first to suggest an experiment to prove a connection. In a letter written in 1750, Franklin suggested that during a storm, a wooden sentry box be placed atop a hill or inside a steeple with a pointed rod attached to the roof. If a man inside the box held a wire touching the rod, Franklin predicted he would see a shower of sparks when lightning struck the rod. After the Royal Society of London published his proposal, a group of Frenchmen put it to the test in May 1752. Before Franklin learned of their success, however, he had decided to try it out himself. He thought he could prove his theory with a wired kite, which could fly higher than a hill or steeple. So as the story goes, on June 10, 1752, Franklin and his son William hoisted a kite with a wire attached to it into the stormy skies. When lightning struck, the resulting electricity in the air charged the metal key that he had tied to the end of the string. Franklin touched his knuckles to the key, and sparks jumped from the key to his hand, proving his theory that electricity was in fact gathering in the clouds above. And he was even able to collect some of the charge in a Leyden jar, a special device made for storing electricity. The sparks Franklin felt were from electricity in the air and not from lightning striking the kite, as some versions of the legend would have it. If lightning had struck the kite directly, Franklin would most likely have been killed, as was a Russian man who attempted the same experiment several months later. News spread quickly of Franklin's electrical amusements, as he called his experiments, making him the most celebrated man of science in the world. He coined terms such as battery, conductor, charge, discharge, and electric shock, among others, and invented the lightning rod, which Franklin considered one of the greatest achievements of his career. And for a man who signed the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, that's saying a lot.
All right. I believe the book has it a little bit out of chronological order. Here's the Reformation, the Enlightenment, then the First Great Awakening. This is the order that it happens in on a timeline, but we're going to talk about the Great Awakening first. I don't know why they do that, but we're going in the order of the book here. You do not have to write all three of these down. Write down that something like this. The Puritans, the Pilgrims, they come to America. They expect it to be a shining example, a city on the hill, if you would. And then they get here, and the way things are working out for their kids, they've kind of lost some of that zeal. It's not turning into this religious utopia that perhaps they envisioned, all right? And so the First Great Awakening is people coming back and this revival movement, like, we got to get back to our roots. We got to get back to our religious roots anyway. People wept, they sang, they're moved by the Spirit. I put Netflix down at the time because this is a form of entertainment. Not everybody's coming for the religious reasons. You're coming for the mass gathering reasons. And if you remember from the last lesson, we learned that they're sitting around shelling nuts and telling stories. There's only so many stories you can hear 5 times, and then it's like, hey, let's go to the revival and hear something new. So that's the Great Awakening, okay? The religious fervor that it takes to get to America, then it's kind of died out a little bit, and now it's kind of coming back, okay? The outcome of the First Great Awakening will be the same outcome of the Second Great Awakening, more religious splits, okay? Get new denominations. Here's another outcome, though. If I can choose my religion, and what sect of the religion and what denomination, if I can choose my religion, why can't I choose my government? Why can't I choose who's in charge of me and to what degree that they're in charge of? Because remember, at this time, they're still subject to the king mostly. So this becomes the idea of self-rule and that we should be in charge. That's been planted, but now that's growing, okay? And I want you to see that. That's growing 100 years before there's even a United States. Here's a small video.
In the 18th century, the English colonies in America encountered a new and different form of religious expression, revivalism. Part of a broader evangelical movement taking place in England, Scotland, and Wales, this great awakening of religious fervor swept across the Atlantic and into the colonies.
The First Great Awakening occurred in America in the late 1730s into the early 1740s when it peaked around 1741-42. It was a time of tremendous religious upheaval in American life. For some, it was a great blessing. For others, it was just mass enthusiasm.
We have to understand these revivals not as bringing in people who had never heard the Word of God. This is not like missions to, people in foreign lands. The people hearing this Word had actually been, most of them, churchgoers already.
Usually we date the beginning of the awakening with a revival that took place in Jonathan Edwards's parish in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1734 or 1735.
Jonathan Edwards was not an emotional sort of preacher. Jonathan Edwards was a true intellectual. In fact, Jonathan Edwards is regarded by many scholars as one of a handful, just a small handful of original thinkers that America has produced.
He became pastor of the church in Northampton when his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, passed away. When he inherited the church, he called it a church of dry bones.
Okay, welcome back. So here's the Enlightenment. Problems can be solved, according to the Enlightenment, with human reason, not necessarily a religious take on things. A search for natural laws. There's a 3 words: life, liberty, property. Okay, John Locke is going to say life, liberty, property. Yes, you should write that down. Locke equals life, liberty, property. Here's all the questions that you need to be able to answer. Later, Thomas Jefferson's going to say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where do you think Thomas Jefferson got life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? From Locke, life, liberty, property. Does that make sense? So in the Declaration of Independence, when I say who wrote it, you say Thomas Jefferson. And when I say Thomas Jefferson was influenced by which Enlightenment thinker, you say John Locke. And I say, how can you prove to me that Thomas Jefferson was influenced by John Locke? You say John Locke said life, liberty, property. Thomas Jefferson said life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Boom, they're pretty much plagiarized. Oh, can't say that, but they're close. Okay, they're close. So here's John Locke, and you can read The Social Contract on page 122, or you can watch this awesome video about John Locke.
Okay, let's face it, philosophers are confusing with their big words and their ethical debates. Who knows what they're talking about? And none are more confusing than a British guy by the name of John Locke. His specialty was politics. Yeah, I know. That sounds confusing and boring. But like most things that are confusing and boring, what he had to say was actually very important. His theory of politics had 3 parts: natural rights, consent of the people, and a moral obligation to rebel. You heard me right. Moral obligation to rebel. Excited yet? So the first part centers around the idea that when God created man, he endowed each of us with certain rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and property, and they're very important. They're known as natural rights, rights that were naturally given. As long as you exist, you get these rights. They should never be denied to anybody. They should never be taken away by anybody. They're for keepsies. The right to life is the right to live, and live whatever life you want as long as it doesn't infringe on the right to life of others. That means you can dye your hair pink and listen to rock music all day. You can have a cat or 2 or whatever and anything in between, just as long as you don't take any life away from anybody else. Sorry, Jason Voorhees. The right to liberty means no one has the right to imprison you against your will, unless you're sent to jail for being naughty. That means the world is your playground. You can explore nature in Europe and wherever you want, but if you break the law, your right to freedom is taken away, and you go to jail. Pretty fair. Now, the right to property seems a little out of place in this list, but really, the right to property is a combination of the right to life and liberty. What? Okay, I'll break it down. Bear with me. In this state of nature, men are free to do as they please, so long as they preserve peace and preserve mankind in general. Because they have the right to self-preservation, it follows that they have the right to those things that will help them to survive and be happy. God has provided us with all these materials we need to pursue those things, but these natural resources are useless unless men applies their efforts to them. We own our bodies, therefore anything we acquire as a result of physical labor of our bodies becomes our property. So what does that look like? If I need shelter to live and I work to cut down a bunch of trees, the house I built is mine. If I need corn to live and I plow soil and plant seeds, the corn that grows will be mine. If I need protein to live and I raise chickens and I love them every day, the eggs they produce will be mine. Our work is an extension of ourselves and therefore just as important as our rights to life and liberty. Now, because everyone has the same rights, John Locke believed that made everyone equal. That meant no man had a higher status, was more valuable, or had more rights than anybody else. I'm pretty sure everybody loved that idea. So where does government fit into all this? Well, according to John Locke, government power is the natural power of each man collectively giving up into the hands of a designated body, forming a compact or agreement. Wait, what? I thought we could never and should never give up our natural rights. Ever. You're right. But there is one time it's acceptable to relinquish a few rights. Our rights are really important, but we're just one person. There are a lot of bad guys out there that don't always follow moral laws of nature and might try to take away our rights. We need a hero to protect those rights. A government hero. Government forms when a bunch of people give a smaller group of people, whom they elect, access to their rights. And then a government is born. Aww. The citizens citizens enter a compact with the government. Citizens give the government some of their rights. In exchange, the government protects their rights when they're under attack and act in ways that best serve the people. The government exists because the people allow it to. But what happens when the government becomes evil? What if a government tries to take away one of our natural rights? What if it denies us the right to life? What if it doesn't allow us to be free and explore and find new ways to be happy? No! What if they take away our right to property? Not to worry. John Locke believes that the community has a moral obligation to revolt against or otherwise replace any government that forgets that it exists only for the people's benefit. That means out with the old, in with the new, start from scratch with a better government. Why would he say something that extreme, that we should get rid of an entire government? Natural rights are that important, according to John Locke, and maybe some colonists.
Okay, now Montesquieu. I put his full name there. He's just known as Montesquieu if you know him like I do. But if you wanted to call him his full name, it's Baron de Montesquieu Charles Louis de Senant, whatever it says there. I don't know. I just call him Montesquieu. Hey, or even Monty for short. Listen, he comes up with the idea, he's important for two things. Separation of powers, 3 branches of government. Yes, you write down Montesquieu equals separation of powers, 3 branches of government. Guess what? In the United States, we've got 3 branches of government. We try to have separation of powers. Where did we get this idea from? Montesquieu, that's right. Okay, good job. Okay, so that's it for the lesson. Let's go all the way back real quick. I'm going to try to do this more often. And let's review what we've learned, okay? So we're going back to the outline. Do we know what triangle trade is? Okay, it was trade between New England, England, Africa, okay? And what's the Middle Passage? That's the part from Africa to the Bahamas or from Africa to wherever. It's the part with people on it. What's the Great Awakening? A religious revival. What's one of the big outcomes from the Great Awakening? Okay, more denominations, absolutely. What's another outcome? Yeah, people are going to say, hey man, I get to choose my religion. I want to choose my government, okay? And they don't get to choose it yet. Not for another 70, 80 years, but we're going to get to there. 50 years maybe? I'll look it up. Okay, Enlightenment. What is the Enlightenment? Okay, people almost trying to use scientific thinking to solve society's problems. Okay, use human reason for the betterment of society. You only need to know 2 thinkers, Locke and Montesquieu. What does Locke say? Life, liberty, and property. Perfect. What is Montesquieu known for? Separation of powers. Perfect. 3 branches of government. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you back here soon for Chapter 5. Take care.